What if the problem was never women, but the fear men had of losing control to them? What if everything history told you about female nature was written not as truth, but as a defense mechanism of weak rulers and anxious lovers? Tonight we do not attack women. We expose the lies men created about them to protect their own fragile power. Men struggle to understand desire. They struggle to understand influence. And when they fail, they blame women. In this video, we are solving one dangerous illusion, not what women are, but why power feared what it could not own. I am Machiavelli, and this is the truth rulers were too terrified to write clearly. Listen carefully, because arrogance has a way of disguising itself as wisdom, and history has a habit of repeating the lies of powerful men without questioning their origin. When kings spoke of women, they rarely spoke of them as individuals. They spoke of them as forces, storms, temptations, distractions, even threats, not because women were any of these things by nature, but because men in power do not see people, they see reflections. And what they fear reflects the pretend have. In the quote they most, in the quote to knots I observe, it is what reflects I observed. Rulers did not study women. They studied how women made them feel, and whatever made them feel uncertain, they labeled as dangerous. Whatever made them feel powerless, they named as manipulation. Whatever made them feel vulnerable. Of insecure power, a ruler, he does not like to be reminded that his control is not absolute. He commands armies of premies laws. He commands treasure, factories, but he cannot command affections. He cannot command affection. He cannot command attraction. That he cannot hold blow or force to bland loyalty, because not bland thing. When he realizes as he doth calculate, women were not perceived as human complexes that in pursue not clinger because not dominant. Wonder about that men when they were because that men whoever does beg be defectless inside his stem influences they were persistent emotions and upwards and sit as thins and get to depress them but taxes but can be humpy did but not be default coach men at canal new dark langers. They did what power always does when wounded. They revised the story. They said women are the weakness. They said women distract men from greatness. They said women corrupt ambition. But if a man's greatness collapses because someone did not love him enough, then he was never great to begin with. What these men called female nature was nothing more than male inability to tolerate uncertainty. They could control land, but not desire. They could command armies, but could buy loyalty instead of admiration. And instead of admitting this, they transform vulnerability into accusation because men in power are trained not to confess weakness. They are trained to convert weakness into ideology. And so a myth was born not from truth, but from ruler that served perfectly. Because once a lure contradicted the nature of evidences that the problem lies freed from confronting it for simple answers often that their messes always eat each of another because the fearing women and rulers did. Not always they understood power not from truth. And for Ramelson's ology, Narapine from Ponsper's perception, you see. When the throne under control, clothing not fears you return the defiance with it as you woman defined as danger to women because danger attraction became rebellions, but became moral abominable and remained distant as to women because it became Mormon remained to but then the was your agent to women and who in a pimps it both on solver consecrators and curses illusions because of Nazi of the reality they were divvying and the deservers and engine with a form of a person when the last one the whole in his is already bucked their windows your body was so their mass then dispersed so as when power fair to for industry collapses much as but just they ran can't you from language of biology didn't sure. And when power feels uncomfortable, it becomes rigid, it becomes dishonest. This is why the narrative of female nature was not created by observation. They were fear of observing the seeth Lermern, past the crown, past the armor, past the might seat, past the imminent nil destructed rule authorities. So that he made it what all them like primitive rulers recreate, would realize and be reseals true rulers and made projection when power past the best it was created by obtuse lose power for describe women like to fuck then or past the select. It uses others as mirrors instead. Understand this clearly, because most men confuse love with possession, and when possession fails, they redesign love into resentment in the courts of power. Men claim to rule with logic, with discipline, with calculation, yet the moment love entered the room, their empires trembled not because love is weak, because love cannot be commanded. A king can order a soldier to die, but he cannot order a heart to surrender. And it is this difference that created centuries of myths about what they called futurity. Men desired controllity, they desired in trade, they desired to have assurance, but love, by its very nature, offers none of these and, instead of learning how to exist with uncertainty, they tried to dominate it, yet love does not respond to force, it withdraws from it, and when it withdraws, men who are addicted to control do not feel rejected. They feel challenged because for a ruler, rejection is not emotional, it is political. They begin to ask not why they were unloved, but why they were not obeyed, and from that moment love becomes a battlefield. What should have been a dialogue becomes a conquest. What should have been understanding becomes surveillance. What should have been affection becomes strategy. And when they failed to control it, instead of questioning themselves, this is how love turned into mythology. Men began to say women are inconsistent, not because of women. Was women change Billy, but because men miss choice for betrayal. Choice said women. They said women are complicated because women are complex, but because men refused to understand, not dominant understanding. They could not know any jurist, not mean anything. They've been able to those purple didn't know dependent power. Many men even on the withdrawal of value is so they ended up a ruler. So they emotional illusion superior and the villain is superior of the powered up to fast version of subility. Well, so they could believe mission nature of love, the perfective self rather than obeys, meant that love was not guaranteed, and this terrified men who were used to guaranteed loyalty purchased with gold or fear, because love could not be bought, love could not be legislated, love because array forced, so they feared it, that the truth was, but the traction was not a tax. Fear that a trash views, they feared its independence. They instead electional, the indescribed it could legislated, could not be of adapting. They created philosophy to defend their pride. They claimed women were ruled by emotion, but what they meant was women could not be ruled by them. They claimed women were fickle, but what they meant was women had the freedom to change their minds. Women were socials of broken power, out of a fear love. But what bind them to Solomon did not power strut a fear love. For men accustomed to command was the one refused to be colonized, and instead of respecting it, they tried to redefine it. They taught future generations that love requires control, that jealousy is strength, that's masculinity, that possession is devotion. So boys, wiveled as grusen, who learn to land, call it and be taken, and then tell out to me is at first when the calling the further flows is when someone in need bullying how to fuse to be taken. Men who never ask mass proves with a dominantly used like Yunini bussy displaced that domination in the Jefferson said women in reeves like in jealousy so be trying to turn are emotional. Not men, it said women are confusing. Not men, it said women are impossible. Not men anything to avoid saying men never learned how to love controlling because love without control requires vulnerability and vulnerability feels to like raise roads on dominant again. So rather than learning a new strength, they defended the old books about they feared one unpredictable, unnatural thinkability. They could not take towels on ones. They passed dated warnings. They know the one they wrote bakeable, but surely they not love demanded by force, that they founded it by force. So they have given something sure, which is system. Those they were beating the shoes and straining when the system failed, as all force systems do. They did not question their methods. They questioned the nature of those who refused to submit. And so the myth survived not because it was true, but because it protected fragile pride, turned fear into formed meal to philosophy, insecurity and trained to cultural doctorating, masquerading as wisdom. Power, as most men define it, is measured in crowns, armies, and titles. Yet there exists a subtler dominion, a dominion that rules not through force but through perception, persuasion, and presence. This dominion has often been occupied by those who never held thrones, never commanded armies, never signed decrees. Women for centuries have exercised this power quiet, invisible, and infinitely more enduring than any title a man could claim. History is written by the victors, and victors are usually men. But if we peer between the lines, we see women shaping events from behind the curtain. They shaped decisions, influenced alliances, and determined the fates of kings, not by the strength of sword or the weight of law, but by understanding observation and subtle manipulation of perception. And this is what unsettled male rulers most. Because they measure all influence by what can be controlled, and control was never possible here. A ruler may conquer a city, but a ruler cannot conquer loyalty that chooses for itself. A man may command obedience, yet he cannot command respect or admiration without skill, strategy, or sometimes luck. Women mastered the art of influence precisely because they understood the limits of overt power and the effectiveness of indirect sway. The court, the council, even the household, all arenas of authority, could be subtly altered by the decisions of those who were not officially in power. A queen may sign treaties, but a consort could determine whether those treaties are accepted or resisted through persuasion. A princess may marry a prince, but a sister, a mother, a confidant, could shift alliances with nothing more than counsel or quiet warning. Men trained to equate authority with force often failed to see these undercurrents until the consequences became undeniable. Wars were lost, fortunes squandered, empires destabilized. Not because of open rebellion, but because influence operated in ways that rulers could not anticipate and could not legislate against. Observe carefully how men responded to this. They often described it as manipulation, deception, or trickery. They feared it, resented it, and labeled it as unnatural. And yet what was being described was merely strategy and insight. A woman who understands human nature, who anticipates reactions, who speaks when the time is right and remains silent when discretion serves better. That is not cunning for the sake of cunning. That is mastery of influence, a mastery that even kings could not command. Rulers are impatient with subtlety. They prefer open confrontation to silent persuasion. They prefer armies that march at their order to ideas that move minds at their discretion. And yet, history repeatedly shows that minds, once swayed, have more enduring power than armies. A decision influenced quietly in a private chamber can determine the outcome of battles, the fate of dynasties, and the rise or fall of entire nations. Women, in these spaces, exercise power without the fanfare, without recognition, and without formal authority. It is not only in politics that this influence manifests. In society, in commerce, in alliances of culture and wealth, women have shaped the world silently. Patronage, mentorship, and counsel allowed women to steer outcomes. Their insight into character, motive, and ambition became a currency of its own. Men often envied it, feared and misunderstood it because they were conditioned to equate influence only with visible authority. The invisible hand of persuasion, they assumed, was inherently suspicious, and thus they created narratives of female cunning to justify their own failures to recognize power outside of titles. Consider the subtlety required to shape events without recognition. One must understand timing, measure ambition, observe ego, and intervene without appearing to intervene. A word spoken in confidence, a suggestion disguised as opinion, a gentle nudge toward choice. All can alter the course of history, and yet those who wield such influence rarely receive acknowledgement. The historian who credits victories to kings and generals often overlooks the subtle guidance that shaped those victories in the first place. This is why the myth of female weakness persists in the writings of rulers. It is easier to call someone manipulative than admit that one's decisions were shaped by another who operates outside conventional power. Influence without thrones is the ultimate form of control because it cannot be challenged directly, cannot be attacked openly, and cannot be legislated against. It is enduring precisely because it works in shadows and within perception. Men, trained to believe that authority is the possession of those with titles, often mistake indirect influence for subversion. They forget that true power is not what one holds openly, but what one can make happen without needing to claim it. Women, in understanding this, exploited the very blind spots of male rulers. They guided alliances, prevented disasters, brokered peace, and even determined who would rise and who would fall. All without ever needing a sword or a seal. It is a lesson that rulers seldom admit power that is recognized as fleeting. Power that is unrecognized, yet effective, is eternal. And in this eternal power, women have always excelled, shaping the course of history with subtlety, patience, and intelligence that men frequently misunderstood or dismissed as something other than what it truly was. Listen closely, for what is called nature is rarely anything natural at all. History has a habit of naming patterns as inevitabilities, yet these so-called truths are often nothing more than stories invented by those who sought to protect power and justify failure. The concept of female nature is one such story, a tale told not to reveal reality, but to disguise the insecurities of men and the fragility of empires. Men have always been uncomfortable with forces they cannot measure. They organize armies, levy taxes, construct fortresses, and draft laws. All things visible, all things tangible. Yet when confronted with influence that cannot be captured in a ledger, when confronted with choice that cannot be dictated, they panic. And from this panic, myth is born. What rulers could not control, they labeled as inherent, unchangeable, and therefore dangerous. This is the first deception, the illusion that what frightens us is a law of nature rather than a reflection of human insecurity. When men wrote about women, they did so as though every emotion, every decision, every ambition were proof of a secret design and innate flaw. And so they described women as fickle, as manipulative, as untrustworthy. They claimed that these traits were natural, but what they meant was predictable. When a person refuses to conform to your expectations, you call it inherent vice. When influence resists authority, you rename it instability. When choice undermines control, you declare it disloyalty. These labels are not evidence of nature. They are evidence of fear and projection. Observe carefully how history repeats the story. Kings, generals, and advisors alike were terrified of female agency because it was subtle, enduring, and impossible to legislate. And instead of understanding it, they made it a cautionary tale. They taught future generations that deviation from male authority was dangerous, that independence was unnatural, and that influence without formal power was suspect. In doing so, they codified a fiction, one that would survive long after the men who invented it were gone. The truth is far more revealing. Women, like all humans, act according to circumstance, opportunity, and desire. They seek security, alliance, affection, and sometimes ambition, just as men do. Yet because men were conditioned to expect obedience, They interpreted initiative as threat. They interpreted negotiation as manipulation. They interpreted freedom as betrayal. And when these behaviors did not align with the narratives men wanted to believe, they transformed observation into moral law. They named fear as wisdom, projection as strategy, and imagination as truth. Consider the courts, the councils, and the salons of Europe. Women who guided empires, who influenced decisions, who advised kings and princes, were rarely described as wise or strategic. They were described as dangerous, capricious, or unnatural. And yet every action, every choice, was rational when viewed through the lens of ambition, preservation, or understanding. The illusion of female nature is born precisely at the point where rational behavior conflicts with male expectation. Rulers are notorious for this. When a woman refuses to act as a passive ornament, they label her unpredictable. When she makes a choice independent of their will, they declare her disloyal. When she wields influence without recognition, they brand her manipulative. And thus, the very behaviors that demonstrate intelligence and agency are reframed as proof of some innate, immutable defect. The myth is maintained not because it is true, but because it protects ego, justifies failure, and preserves authority. This illusion extends beyond individual perception. It shapes politics, law, and culture. Entire societies have been organized around it. Texts, treatises, and moral codes instruct men on how to manage the dangerous nature of women, yet all the while, these instructions reveal more about male insecurity than female behavior. The stories told to rationalize control over women reveal the fragility of those who demanded obedience and the desperation of those who feared influence without domination. And it is important to recognize the power of storytelling itself. History is not neutral. The pen is more formidable than the sword when wielded to preserve perception. Narratives about nature serve as invisible armies, shaping belief, expectation, and action. By labeling women as naturally, unpredictable, or emotional, men created a narrative that excused their inability to understand, predict, or accept influence they could not control. It is not nature that is dangerous. It is the story men told about nature that shapes perception, limits opportunity, and justifies fear. The illusion of female nature is therefore a mirror reflecting the weaknesses, insecurities, and assumptions of men in power. It is a political construct masquerading as immutable truth, and this construct is remarkably resilient because it offers certainty in place of complexity, blame in place of accountability, and order in place of understanding. It transforms independence into threat, insight into deception, and agency into irrationality, ensuring that the myth will endure as long as rulers fear what they cannot dominate, choose what they cannot command, and judge what they cannot possess. And now, let us step back and observe the truth that lies behind centuries of myth. What has been called female nature is rarely nature at all. It is a reflection, an echo of the fears, insecurities, and ambitions of those who could not command it. Men feared what they could not control, despised what they could not predict, and explained what they could not understand. In doing so, they wove narratives, legends, and warnings, and passed them down as truths. Power, perception, love, influence, and myth are all entangled. Men projected their weakness onto others, confused possession with affection, and interpreted independence as rebellion. Women shaped the course of history without swords, without crowns, and often without recognition. Yet the stories that survive focus not on their ingenuity, their insight, or their strategy, but on the illusions created by those who feared them. History has been kind to the bold, the visible, and the titled. It has been cruel to the subtle, the strategic, and the unseen. And in the shadows of empires, in the quiet corridors of influence, women have exercised power more enduring and effective than any throne. The myths we inherit are therefore warnings, not about what women are, but about what happens when power fears what it cannot possess, when authority mistakes influence for subversion, and when the human mind prefers certainty over understanding. To understand history, to understand power, one must strip away the stories imposed by fear and see the mechanisms of influence for what they truly are. Only then can we recognize the brilliance with those who operated outside the spotlight, the dangers imagined by those who could not grasp them, and the truths hidden behind illusion. In the end, the brutal truth is not about female nature. It is about the nature of power itself and the lies we tell to preserve it.